Evening, everybody, and welcome to this month's Acting for Justice event. My name is Jack Jezreel, and I'm part of the staff of Just Faith Ministries. I'm joined by my colleague, as always, Leela Oakley, and we're delighted you could join us tonight. So let's begin our program this evening with prayer. This prayer comes from Sojourners and was written by Rose Berger. I'm going to use the first half of the prayer for our opening and the last half of the prayer for our closing. Let us pray. God of comfort, send your Spirit to encompass all those whose lives are torn apart by violence and death in Israel and Palestine. You are the advocate of the oppressed and the one whose eye is on the sparrow. Let arms reach out in healing rather than aggression. Let hearts mourn rather than militarize. God of justice, give strength to those whose long work for a just peace might seem fruitless now. Strengthen their resolve. Do not let them feel alone. Show us how to support their work and bolster their courage. Guide religious leaders to model unity and reconciliation across lines of division. Guide political leaders to listen with their hearts as they seek peace and pursue it. Help all people choose the rigorous path of just peace and disavow violence. God of love, we lift up Palestine and Israel, its people, its land, its creatures. War is a monster that consumes everything in its path. Peace is a gift shared at meals of memory with Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Let us burn incense, not children. Let us break bread, not bodies. Let us plant olive groves, not cemeteries. We beg for love and compassion to prevail on all your holy mountains. Amen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's presenter. Michele Dunne is the Executive Director of the Franciscan Action Network. Before coming to the network, her career focused on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy. From 2006 to 2021, she headed programs focused on peace, human rights, and democracy in the Middle East at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Atlantic Council. Before that, she served for nearly 20 years in the U.S. Department of State, including assignments in Jerusalem and Cairo. She holds a PhD from Georgetown University, lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, and she is a professed secular Franciscan. And Michele, we're delighted to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Jack. Good evening, everyone. I'm really so pleased to be with you this evening, friends, although our topic is a somber one. So, I was asked to address the issue of what's at the heart of violence in the Middle East and how can Franciscan spirituality help ground us in efforts to advocate for peace and security in the Middle East. So I'm going to, of course, I have a PowerPoint presentation for you, so I will share that with you now. There we go. Yeah, this is, and I also, I hope you'll forgive me, I will also begin with a prayer because this is a very special prayer. Those of you who know about St. Francis already know this one, but it's very helpful to me in grounding me before I speak. This is a prayer that St. Francis composed before this crucifix, the San Damiano crucifix. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart. Give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity, sense, and knowledge that I might carry out your holy and true command. Amen. So here are the questions. And first of all, I want to say when people say Middle East, they mean a lot of different things. But my understanding was that our conversation today is basically going to be about the Israel-Palestine issue. And so, I'll have some reference to other countries, but I just want to say I'm not in this talk really going to delve into other issues like Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, many of the other things that people mean when they say Middle East. In questions, if you want to raise things like that, I'm happy to do my best with them. But tonight I'm going to be focusing on, and these are sort of my sub questions here. What is the nature of the Israel-Palestine struggle as I see it? How long has it been going on? What efforts have been made to resolve it? And for us, as people of faith who love peace, what is ours to do? So the nature, the nature of the issue, it's sometimes called the Israel-Palestine issue. In Arabic, that's what it's also often called, al-Qadiyya, the issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Sometimes it's called the struggle. Sometimes here people use the word conflict. Anyway, but it is a struggle, and it is a struggle between two competing narratives, two competing national and religious narratives about the same land, which has been called Palestine by the ancient Egyptians, at least for at least 2,200, 2,300 years now. It has been called Palestine. And that was a term later used by the Assyrians, Greeks, Romans. And but this is also the homeland of the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which also arose around that time, 1200, 1300 BC, in the same territory. And of course, the territory we're talking about, right? It extends from the Mediterranean in the west to the Jordan River in the east, north to Lebanon, south past Gaza to Sinai. So it is the ancestral home of both Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs, and Israelis, Israeli Jews. And we still see today sharply conflicting narratives about what this land is, to whom it belongs. Now, when we talk about, how long has this been going on, it bothers me a bit when I hear people say things like, this has been going on for thousands of years, and it's never going to be resolved. Well, even though, yes, I did say that, this area has been called Palestine for a couple thousand years, but we're not talking about a struggle or a fight of a couple of thousand years. We're really talking mostly mostly about 100 years is how long this struggle has been going on. Through the end of the 19th century, the population of historic Palestine was primarily Arab, Muslims and Christians, but there was also a small Jewish community living there, sort of for always. But then what happened is, in the late 19th century, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the Zionist political movement arose in Europe, calling for a return of Jews to Palestine. And this was mostly in response to pogroms and anti-Semitism in Europe, especially Eastern Europe. Small numbers of Jews started to move to Palestine in the 1870s, 1880s, more in the early 20th century, and then, of course, many, many more as Nazism arose in Europe, and especially, of course, during and after the Holocaust. So, around that same time, which is starting around, say, World War I, a sense of modern Palestinian national identity also began to arise among the Arab population. By the 1920s and escalating into the 1930s, violence broke out between Jews and Arab Palestinians in Palestine. And it became increasingly difficult for the colonial power at the time, Great Britain, to manage the conflict, which led to eventually a UN plan to partition the territory into Jewish and Arab states, which was rejected by Arabs. It was accepted by Jews, and the state of Israel was founded in 1948. And then, I'm just going to skip ahead. I don't want to go through, but there were several wars between in 1948, again in 1967, again in 1973, between the state of Israel and Arab states that were trying to, basically take back the territory and so forth. At the end of all these wars, as you know, Israel ended up occupying the West Bank and Gaza, basically all of historic Palestine, as well as other territory, the Golan Heights, and at one time, and the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai eventually, of course, was given back to Egypt when Egypt had a peace treaty with Israel. But so since those wars, there have been peace agreements between Israel and several Arab states. First Egypt, as I mentioned, later Jordan, much more recently the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan. But there's never been a durable agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. And meanwhile, these two parties have really changed significantly. Right? I mean, Israel, if we look back to 1948 or even the 60s or whatever, Israel was seen as a sort of, underdog, scrappy underdog trying to survive in this hostile region and so forth. And now, of course, Israel is very, very different. A major military power with nuclear and other highly lethal weapons. And Israeli society has also changed a great deal, has drifted significantly to the right politically, and the population in Israel has become far more religiously and socially and politically conservative over time. You're aware, of course, that there's a very far right government in Israel now. Palestinians, meanwhile, also changed a lot. I mean, and they've struggled to find ways to resist occupation and to try to end occupation by Israel. Palestine Liberation Organization was formed in the 60s, dominated political leadership until the mid 2000s. Because what happened was, as you will just to remind you, in the 1980s, after the Palestinian Liberation Organization did embrace armed struggle from the 60s until the 80s, and then following the first Palestinian uprising, the Palestinians held a huge national congress and basically voted to negotiate with Israel and to accept the idea that their goal would be a Palestinian state alongside Israel, not the destruction of Israel. And the PLO invested in that process, but that process ultimately failed. I'll say a little bit more about that. And Yasser Arafat, the PLO leader, died in the 2000s. Was replaced by Mahmoud Abbas, who's still technically occupying the presidency of Palestine, the head of the Palestinian Authority right now. Although he has very, very little credibility. We can talk about that among Palestinians. We could talk about that more if you're interested in the details of that, but we've seen the emergence of Hamas. Hamas is, it's an Arabic acronym, actually. The full name is Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, or the Islamic Struggle Movement. And it arose out of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s, right around the time of the first Palestinian Intifada or uprising. And it emerged as a competitor with the PLO, which was a secular nationalist revolutionary organization. And sort of struggled, competed with the PLO for leadership of the Palestinian cause. And this actually led to a limited Palestinian civil war. And it, ended up with Hamas in control of Gaza, and basically the Palestinian Authority, which is headed by the PLO leadership in charge of the West Bank, a disastrous rift for Palestinians. So, what has happened is, Israel occupying, Palestinians dispossessed in many cases, of their land, and divided into these two places with these two different political movements. Another really important development, I'll say more about this in a couple of minutes, has been the construction of Israeli settlements throughout the West Bank. I think really one of the most important things that has happened that has prevented any kind of peace settlement between Israelis and Palestinians. So, what kind of efforts have been made to resolve it? I mean, I won't go through the whole diplomatic history, but I'm sure you remember a lot of this. Basically, there have been attempts by Western powers since World War One, really, to broker some sort of a settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Right? I mentioned the UN partition plan of 1948, and there have been many, many plans since then, and so forth. The most consequential one arose in the early 1990s, the Oslo Agreement, which I'm sure you remember. And in the Oslo Agreement, which was signed in 1993, you see the picture of the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the late PLO leader Arafat shaking hands with President Clinton. So in that agreement, Israel accepted the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians, and the PLO renounced armed struggle and recognized Israel's right to exist in peace. Both sides agreed that a Palestinian Authority would be established and would assume governing responsibilities in the West Bank and Gaza over a 5-year period, during which the so-called final status issues would be negotiated. What would be the borders? What would be the status of the city of Jerusalem? What would happen to the many Palestinian refugees who'd had to leave their homes in waves in 48 and 67 and so forth? Would they be able to return? Would they be compensated? What would happen? Now, what happened was, this agreement was established in 93, and there were talks and talks and talks. But by the time that the end of Bill Clinton's second term was approaching, almost no progress had been made on those issues. No meaningful progress had been made on any of those issues. And basically, what Clinton and the Israelis, you see on the right, that's Ehud Barak, who was prime minister at that time in 2000, just before Clinton left office. They basically tried to kind of rush through a deal. And they tried to strong arm Yasser Arafat into accepting something, which he refused to accept. And then there was an escalation of tensions, and the second major Palestinian uprising broke out. And then, relations between the Israelis and Palestinians really deteriorated after that. Now, just to say a couple of words regarding Gaza, because that's where I know, the focus really is right now. Gaza, as I mentioned, Gaza was under Palestinian Authority control. It has remained technically under Palestinian rule, but in effect, it is under Israeli occupation. The Israelis control totally who and what, and this is before the current war, who and what can enter and exit Gaza, which is often referred to as being, in effect, an open-air prison. There have been at least 5 wars between Hamas and Israel since 2006. I mentioned that there were Palestinian elections in 2006 that Hamas technically won. I won't go through everything that happened, but basically Hamas wasn't really allowed to take office. And it ended up, as I said, with sort of a limited civil war between Hamas and the PLO. And Hamas ended up in control of Gaza and has been in control of Gaza ever since. Since 2006, there have been, as I said, about 5 wars between Hamas and Israel, and some form of armed cross-border conflict really every year from 2006 until now. Now, until October 7th of this year, most of that conflict was carried out via the air. Hamas rockets, Israeli missile attacks, so forth. There was some fighting on the ground, but it was small scale. The biggest previous war between Hamas and Israel was in 2014, all right, when about 2,200 Palestinians and 71 Israelis were killed during a 50-day conflict. But the scale of the Hamas attack and this horrific scale of fatalities since that attack is unprecedented, right? We have not seen this kind of fighting between Israelis and Palestinians before. So it's totally unclear, where this war is going to go, when it's going to end. I will say this: from what I see, I think Israel seems determined to keep a depopulated buffer zone in northern Gaza. If you'll notice, there was a lot of tremendous destruction and loss of life, tremendous destruction and killing in northern Gaza by the Israeli forces. And now they're trying very hard not to let Gazans return to that area, even during this short ceasefire. I think the Israelis are going to try to keep a whole part of Gaza, which is already an extremely crowded, territory, depopulated. And then for the rest of Gaza, what's going to happen? I would say Israel's probably going to end up actively occupying all of Gaza for some time, and we'll see where it will go from there. I can't, this war, I wish it was over. I'm afraid it probably is not over. So it's hard to predict where things will go. In the meantime, I want to talk about just sort of a few larger, bigger picture points that I feel don't get enough notice when we talk about the Israel-Palestine issue, and that I think have an enormous effect on what happens and whether there can be some kind of resolution of this struggle. One of them I mentioned is Israeli settlements. So very shortly after Israel occupied the West Bank, which had previously been ruled since 1948 or occupied really since 1948 by Jordan. After Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, it started settling its civilian population in the West Bank, in Gaza too, but in much, and even in Sinai in small numbers when they held Sinai, but really in a much bigger way in the West Bank, which is for Jews the biblical heartland. You saw those maps of Israel and Judah, the biblical kingdoms. I mean, this is very much the heartland of biblical Israel. So, what has happened through settlements has been, as I have said, the dispossession of Palestinians from their land in various different ways. There are so many different legal stratagems and so forth, used by Israeli authorities and by settler groups to get control of land and to deprive Palestinians of their land and to expand and expand. This, just get myself on the right page here. what we're looking at now is up and down the West Bank, up and down the West Bank, and in Jerusalem, which was divided during the 48 to 67 period into West and East Jerusalem, now, totally occupied by Israel. There are now about 279 Israeli settlements, communities. Some of them are very small. Some of them are a bunch of trailers on a hilltop. Some of them are enormous cities with, stone buildings and schools and hospitals and every kind of infrastructure you can imagine. So, and there are some 700,000 Israelis living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And I don't know if you can, I was having a hard time finding exactly the map I wanted. The map on the left shows you, this is what the West Bank kind of looked like before there were settlements, right? There are these Palestinian cities, and of course, many, many towns and villages in between them. It was totally populated by Palestinians. What you see on the right, and this is kind of a complicated map, but it shows you all the different ways in which Israel has, gained control of territory in the West Bank. And there are many, many Israeli settlements. And the Israeli settlements have become an enormous physical impediment to the creation of a Palestinian state. That whole Oslo process and many of the other negotiations that have taken place since then have all been about the so-called two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside Israel. But in my view, that has become physically impossible because the West Bank is just like Swiss cheese now. There are Israeli communities throughout. There are hundreds of thousands of Israelis living there, some of whom living there for a couple of generations now, right? This goes back to the early 70s. And how would you create at this point a Palestinian state that has any kind of sovereignty, any kind of physical contiguity? So, I mean, and what this means is, and I'll just want to tell you one story from my time. I arrived, as a young, idealistic diplomat in Jerusalem at the American consulate in 1991. And it was a really exciting time because it was just at the time, if you remember, the Madrid Peace Conference. It was the first time Israelis and Palestinians had sat down together at an international peace conference, and it opened up this whole negotiating process, which, as I mentioned, led to the Oslo Agreement, which was brokered by Norway in 1993. So, there was all this shuttle diplomacy, and there was a real belief that there could be a two-state solution. There could be a Palestinian state created alongside Israel, and these two peoples could live in peace, and all kinds of exciting things were going on. So I was very pleased to be part of this, and I was part of it for a couple of years. But the very first week I arrived in Jerusalem, one of my colleagues, another diplomat at the consulate, said, "I want you to give me a day this week. I have to take you to see something." So I went with him, and we went in a car, and we drove up and down the West Bank, and he showed me the settlements. This is 1991, when there were a third of the settlements and a third of the settlers as there are now. But they were strategically placed on every hilltop, and they went from the south to the north to the east they were all over the place. And as we drove around, I said, "Oh, wait a minute. What's happening here? We're about to enter into these negotiations, but the Israelis don't intend to give any of this up. They intend to keep it all." That's how it looked to me physically. That's exactly what the settlements were there for, to ensure that Israel would keep it all, would keep all the West Bank. but I was told, oh, well, no, don't be so pessimistic. There can be negotiations. There could be land swaps. People could be persuaded to, bought out of their properties and persuaded to move back to Israel proper once a Palestinian state is. And I sort of, you know, put down my own doubts and went ahead and participated in the diplomacy and everything. And I have very mixed feelings about that now, about having been a party to that, because I think the handwriting was on the wall. This was 1991. This is a long time ago, right? And yet we've kept talking about a two-state solution as though um, it could emerge. And I have to say, as much as I believed in it, I wanted it to be true. I personally worked for 10 years on this in the State Department in various different jobs before, during, and after I went to Jerusalem. And yet now I feel that that's very, very, very unlikely, just next to impossible to emerge. So that is, one of the major issues that I feel, and I get concerned when, people talk about this issue and sometimes they don't say much about settlements. They say a lot of things about the deficits in Palestinian leadership, which are true, the drift to the right in Israel, radicalization on both sides, and these being the things that prevent a solution. Yes, those are real impediments, but I feel that Israeli settlements are a much, much larger one. Another thing is just to say something about the role that the United States has played. The United States has exerted a lot of diplomatic effort, um, a diplomatic effort, and toward a solution, and given a lot of assistance, billions of dollars, but it has in no way been a neutral mediator. It has acted, in the words of one former American negotiator, as Israel's lawyer. That's the way the United States acted all along, to kind of come to an agreement with Israel about something and then see if that could be sold to the other side, to the Palestinian negotiators or whatever. And of course, the United States has also financed and armed Israel. I would just say that normally, normally a mediator allies with the weaker party in order to even out the power imbalance in any negotiating situation. But that's the United States has done the opposite here. It has allied itself with the much stronger party, just kind of, really increasing the imbalance. And so, it's important to realize that we as Americans we're really in this thing up to our necks, right? We've been very, very involved. I haven't even talked about US military assistance to Israel. I mean, I've mentioned it in passing, it's so well known. But so we are very, very involved. I don't think that we as Americans can afford to say, well, it's hey, it's just going on over there. It's not about us. Another thing is that, of course, the debate in the United States has become extremely sharp, right? It has really, and it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting how it has changed. I mean, I really think, I think back to past Gaza wars. I remember being very frustrated in 2014 when the Gaza war was going on. I mentioned 2,200 Palestinians, the vast majority of them civilians, were killed in that war. Nobody here said anything. Nobody noticed. 2,200 Palestinians. I don't know, was just a non-event, a non-issue, right? And so it is a bit different this time, right? I mean, we're seeing some differences, in the United States, in the Democratic Party. and between there are many things that have changed in the United States and in the way people look at this issue. Of course, there's been very strong support for Israel. I mean, the October 7th attacks were horrific and inexcusable. Despite all the injustices Palestinians have suffered, I believe it's never excusable to have those kind of brutal attacks, that use of violence and so forth by Hamas. So there was a lot of sympathy for Israel, but there's also been a rise of a lot more sentiment, pro-Palestinian sentiment, and asking about seeing the Israeli retribution for those attacks as being unacceptable. But here's the point that I want to make about this. This has gotten to the point in the United States, and it's not just now. This has been going on for some time now, that there's a real struggle in the United States about the parameters of dialogue here and what is acceptable. There has been an attempt by supporters of Israel to define any criticism of Israeli behavior or of the Israeli occupation as being anti-Semitism. There have been, in the current situation, many bills put forward by members of Congress trying to show their support for Israel, basically, trying to equate support for Palestinian rights as sympathy for terrorism. So I think this is something that's really concerning and something that we need to think about. So then, let me come to what is ours to do. And I want to recall, now we're going to get a little bit just quickly back to the Franciscan part about this story that many of you, I'm sure, know of St. Francis and the Sultan. St. Francis, in 1219, he was deeply distressed at the Crusades, which were being fought at the time in Egypt very, very brutally. And he single-handedly tried to stop the Crusades by going to Egypt at great personal risk, and going to meet with the Sultan Mamluk al-Kamil, and al-Malik al-Kamil. And what's so interesting about that, I mean, there are some indications that some really good things came out of that meeting, not an immediate end to the Crusades. But Francis himself was changed by that encounter. And it led to this very unusual, very ability on his part to reach out to Muslims and to have mutual respect and understanding with Muslims. It certainly led to a deepening of his own faith and a new regard for, and a belief that Muslims as people who loved God. And so it's a very inspiring episode, right? And it's something for us to think about. So if we want to now do as Francis did then, what are some things that we could learn? I would say is, Franciscans, of course, are trying to follow Jesus in the footsteps of Francis of Assisi. And I think we could remember that Francis cared deeply about peace in the Middle East, cared enough, as I said, to go there himself and try to stop the Crusades single-handedly. One thing we can do is pay attention to the issues. I know it's tough, to follow developments and to keep hope alive that things can change in the Middle East, to avoid cynicism or indifference. I've been hearing, I hear a lot of things from friends, family members, as I said, oh, they'll never stop fighting, or well, what Israel's doing in Gaza, it's just like what the U.S. did in Iraq. So as if one evil justifies another, or as though we as Americans can't care about what's going on in Gaza because our country has done terrible things. I mean, I just don't think that kind of cynicism or indifference is productive. And, that certainly isn't the way St. Francis approached these things. Another thing is to do what Francis did, travel to meet the other. I mean, whether that means, it's not possible to go actually to Israel, Palestine right now, but it will be again. And, meet members of other faith groups involved in the issues here in the U.S. And like Francis, be willing to be changed. Go into it with an open mind. Another thing is to persistently raise up the humanity of all involved. It's difficult, but you need to hold several thoughts simultaneously and acknowledge the pain of all. I found that, it's been really difficult since the October 7th attack. I'm at very few gatherings, a few of them, mostly faith-inspired gatherings where people are able to acknowledge the pain of Israelis and Palestinians. And we're not, that's not to create an equivalence in degree of suffering, but to acknowledge that it's there and not to refuse to see the pain of, whichever side you're less sympathetic to. The other thing is, I think it's well time to raise questions. And here I'm really talking about us as Americans when we deal with US officials about US policy and in the public discourse, raise questions about the conventional wisdom, about traditional US policies, which, frankly, really helped to bring the situation to this disastrous point. Question violence as the solution. And think about centering rights. I think, as you've noticed here, I don't have a peace plan. And I don't think we, as people of faith, are called on to have a peace plan right now. It's really not clear what the way is. But I do think if we prioritize the rights of the people involved, then we'll be on a sounder path, much sounder path, than thinking that, just one more round of violence will, eradicate Hamas and solve this problem or something like that. Okay. And then the other thing is, in the United States, stand up for free speech and civil rights here. I think it's really important for us, for people of faith, to stand firmly against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, against anti-Palestinian sentiment, and also against a new McCarthyism that would, deny people the chance to, express their views on this topic. Okay, so I'm going to end the presentation there, but I do have a little something also for you. I have a little an action for you. By the way, there are lots of, I hope we'll talk more about action. There are lots of actions going on here. I'm actually missing one right now that I would have been at. There are lots and lots of pro-peace actions here, and I bet there are where you are as well. But I do have a little action that you can take right now. Franciscan Action Network has created a Christmas peace advocacy card. Oh, thank you, Lila. Lila's put the link to it in here. It's something that you can print out. So it's a piece of paper that you print out and you fold it and you make a card. And it has a nativity image on the front. And inside it says, please support a lasting ceasefire in Gaza and a just peace in the Holy Land. And what we suggest you do with this is print out 3 copies, send one of them to President Biden at the White House, and one each to each of your senators. and please personalize it. Please say, dear so-and-so, put your name on it so they know that you're a real constituent. Feel free to add your own message if you want. But we're hoping to send lots and lots of these forward to, and it's starting to happen way too slowly, right? But there is starting to be a move toward a lasting ceasefire, and only then could there be any other process that could lead the way toward a more lasting peace. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Michele. That's a really helpful overview and background and perspective. So thank you so much for being with us. Now we'd like to give all of us a chance to talk. We're going to break into small groups for about 10 minutes. And Leela has posted a couple of questions in the chat that you can talk together about tonight's presentation. So as always, may I suggest you introduce yourself and then pick one of the questions that you'd like to address, share with the group. As soon as I stop talking, Leela is going to send you an invitation to join a breakout room. So please join in, share some wisdom. If you're lucky, Michele will be in your small group, and we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes for some Q&A time with Michele. Thank you. Well, now we have the opportunity to have a little Q&A with Michele. And Michele, I don't see you on my screen yet, but a couple of things came up in the chat so far. And again, for those of you who are interested in submitting a question, please send them to me, and I'll be glad to sort through them and try to figure out which ones can be addressed tonight. Michele, one of the things that came up was just the mention of a couple of books. And so one of the books mentioned was The Wall Between, What Jews and Palestinians Don't Want to Know About Each Other. I'll just mention that book and ask you for any counsel about if somebody was really interested in digging deeper into this issue. What is a good one or two books that you would recommend for us to read?
Yeah, I have not read that one. I want to say, that I'm not a person working on the Middle East full time anymore. I work on running the Franciscan Action Network. So, I'm aware of that book. There are some, it depends a little bit what you want. I mean, there are books that are histories. There are books that are about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or struggle. There are a lot of books about the kind of the diplomatic history. There are a couple of the books like about the diplomacy and the role played by the United States and others. There's a guy, you might have been seeing him if you've been watching on the news, a guy by the name of Aaron Miller. He's a former colleague of mine at the State Department and at Carnegie Endowment. He wrote a book called The Much Too Promised Land. That's, there really are a lot of different books depending on what angle you're interested. Are you interested in the role the United States has played? Since, we as Americans, that's what we can sort of try to affect. Or, are you looking to learn more about the cultures and the people?
Great. And John Holden has referred to a video that can be watched between the two authors of The Wall Between, if anybody's interested in that. So take a look in the chat, you can see that. Michele, I guess the other question that has come up here is, if you had to recommend the work of any particular groups who are doing, I don't know, the difficult and maybe most effective work in the region, would Christian peacemaker teams come to mind, or does something else come to your mind?
Well, I have enormous respect for what the Christian peacemaker teams do and have been doing. It's extremely courageous and difficult work. Yeah, absolutely. look, you know, what's sad to me nowadays is that there are actually a lot fewer groups than there used to be. You know, when I think back 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, there were a lot more groups that were bringing Israelis and Palestinians together. Um, and you know, there's much less of that work being done. There still are a few groups, and I'm trying to remember the name of the group. There's a women's group in that brings Israeli and Palestinian women together there. You know, I mean, they meet in Jericho or in, you know, in various different places there in Israel and Palestine. Again, that's very courageous work, but it's become much more difficult to do because I think the two societies have become more separated, more hardened, and in a way, you know, more critical of members of their own group that would reach out to the other side. So this work is very now Christian peacemaker teams. This is more like accompaniment work, and you know, I do appreciate that. It's very much needed. In fact, you know, I myself was interested in possibly going um, on an olive harvest accompaniment trip, but you know, I'm afraid a lot of that has probably, you know, may have been suspended. What I didn't really mention during my talk is that tensions in the West Bank, the war is going on in Gaza, but in the West Bank, tensions have escalated sharply. There's a very good video report on the New York Times website today about you know, the very sharp tensions between settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank. There's been a lot of settler sort of aggression and you know, frankly, attempts to try to make Palestinians leave as much as possible while this Gaza conflict is going on. So CPT type of work, it's going to be very, very difficult and very needed.
While you were talking, Michele, a couple of our registrants tonight mentioned a couple of other organizations. One is the Churches for Middle East Peace, and a second one, Standing Together, which is a peace group of Israeli Jews and Israeli Arab citizens. It was mentioned apparently in a BBC broadcast recently. So some other possibilities.
Churches for Middle East Peace has been doing terrific work and terrific work here, you know, in the U.S. During this conflict, and you know, my organization has been partnering with them on a lot of that work.
Michele, Robert asks, does the Israel government in truth want a two-state solution? Do the Israeli people want a two-state solution, or what?
Yeah, I would say no. I would say, you know, there was a time, and it's now decades in the past, when you know, there probably was never a strong consensus inside of Israel in favor of the creation of a Palestinian state. There was a time when there was a significant number of people who would entertain that as an option. And Israel never committed itself to that, by the way, through that whole negotiating process of the 1990s. That was clearly the goal of the Palestinians, but Israel never did agree to the creation of a Palestinian state. And as I've said, I think, you know, the story is told. Just look on the ground. Look at those Israeli settlements. There's no way, I think, if you know, if a country had been considering that they would need to negotiate away this block of land at some point in order to have peace, that they would have settled their own civilian population throughout. So my point of view is no, that's not you know, what the Israelis want. And a lot of Palestinians now would also say it's not possible. They may have, you know, they may have believed in it and wanted it at some point, but between the harsh realities are that it's, as I said, there's just like almost not enough territory left to make it real, or at least not enough contiguous territory. That's the problem. It's not that the Israeli settlements take up such an enormous amount of territory. It's that they're sprinkled everywhere.
Mhm. John wonders, could you shed some light on the understanding of what Christian Zionism is?
I mean, Christian Zionism is, Christian support for the Zionist ideal. I mean, it's rooted in, a concept that the return of the Jews to Zion will bring about the second coming of the Messiah. And so there has been a very strong alliance of particularly evangelical Christians with the state of Israel, and strong support for for settlement throughout the West Bank and Jerusalem and so forth, because of the belief that they are somehow aiding in bringing about the return of the Messiah. I mean, and this has brought about, I think it's been very uncomfortable. I think about most of like the mainline Christian Protestant churches and Catholics and Orthodox Christians and so forth are kind of not, not of that same way of seeing things. But it's led to a very confusing, confusing picture about like what is Christian sentiment, throughout the world about Israel Palestine.
Maybe last question, Michele. Tom asks, the U.S. supports Israel to the tune of $13 million per day. How can the U.S. be a just broker in this war? How, now the U.S. is sending even more millions and billions, why is this? And he also thanks you for your presentation. But any insight into how the U.S. can be a more just broker here?
Well, so this is kind of a paradox, right? On the one hand, the United States is not even-handed, right? The United States strongly supports Israel and has very much, aided and armed and everything Israel. And yet at the same time, it's, because of that, because of the very close U.S. relationship with Israel, the United States government has some influence on Israel. I mean, I would say not all the influence in the world, but it makes a big difference to Israel. Let's put it this way, whether or not it has it's not only the material support, the diplomatic support internationally. The United States protects Israel in international diplomatic forums in the United Nations and so forth. So there's a lot that the United States does for Israel, plus, of course, the exchanges of technology and all kinds of things like that. So I think the United States friendship and support is very important to Israel, which means the United States has some influence on Israel, more than pretty much anybody else. And so the question is, while the United States, cannot be seen as neutral in any way, at the same time, it's very difficult for other parties, let's say Europeans or other parties, to have an influence on Israel without the United States somehow being involved in this. So the United States does need to be involved in some way, right? Otherwise, or you certainly, another party couldn't persuade Israel to do something if the United States is then shielding Israel from any consequences, right? So the United States does need to be involved, and yet I think it's not productive for the United States to have a monopoly on the diplomacy, because of the fact that it hasn't been at all even.
Michele, we have questions pouring in and we have no time. So I think what I need to say is thank you, thank you, thank you. And may I invite everybody who's on the call to kind of give our silent clap for Michele and taking the time to be with us on a very difficult, very painful subject that has such complexity and to it. Thanks again, Michele.
Thank you all. So much more to say, and I hope many of us will be in touch.
Good.
God bless you for your efforts to try to speak for peace and justice.
Thank you. Thank you. And just a reminder to everybody that Leila will be sending out a copy of this presentation. If you want to take it back to your community, your church, your discussion group, and share it there, please do. This information needs to get out. So please consider this a gift and take it wherever you like. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to recommend a Just Faith program for your consideration because of tonight's presentation. Earlier this year, Just Faith Ministries launched a program entitled Just Action. What's distinctive about the program is that it lets you and your group decide what issue you want to act on, and then the program gradually equips you with the tools you can use to address that issue. So pertinent to tonight's presentation, for example, you and your group could decide that you want to respond to the Israel-Palestine reality, and by the end of the 8-week program, you will craft action steps that you and your group can take to respond to this issue. So see our website under programs for more information. Leila's putting a link in the chat if you'd like to learn some more. And finally, there won't be an Acting for Justice event in December. So watch your inbox for details about our January offering. And now, as I promised, I'll close with the second half of the prayer from Rose Berger and Sojourners. Let us pray. God of mercy, even now work on the hearts of combatants to choose life over death, reconciliation over retaliation, restoration over destruction. Help us resist anti-Semitism in all its forms, especially in our own churches. All people, Israelis and Palestinians, deserve to live in peace and unafraid, with a right to determine their futures together. God of the nations, let not one more child or elder be sacrificed on altars of political expediency. Keep safe all people from unjust leaders who would exploit vulnerability for their own distorted ends. Give wise discernment to those making decisions to pursue peace, and provide them with insight into fostering well-being and freedom and thriving for all. Teach all of us to resolve injustices with righteousness, not rockets. Guard our hearts against retaliation, and give us hearts for love alone. Strengthen our faith in you, O God of all flesh, even when we don't have clear answers, so that we may still offer ourselves nonviolently for the cause of peace. Amen. Thank you all for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again in January. Have a lovely holiday, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. Goodbye.